The text message came in at 2047 in the morning, and I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock on the hospital wall when my phone buzzed. My arm was in a splint. My ribs felt like someone had taken a hammer to them. The nurse had just finished adjusting my IV line, and the overhead light was that particular shade of fluorescent that makes everything look like a bad dream. The message was from my brother. "Can this wait? We're in the middle of something. Call tomorrow." I put the phone face down on the blanket and didn't pick it up again for a long time. I should tell you a little about who I was before that night because it matters. I'm 31. I work as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm in Hamilton, Ontario. The kind of job where you're the person everyone calls when something goes sideways, which means my phone is basically an extension of my hand. I bought my condo on Barton Street 3 years ago, a one-bedroom that needed work but was mine. I drove a used Honda Civic with 90,000 kilometers on it, which I'd paid off 6 months before the accident. I was careful with money. I had an RRSP, a TFSA I'd been building since I was 24, and an emergency fund sitting in a high-interest savings account at Simplii. I was, by most practical measures, doing fine on my own. The thing about growing up with my brother, I'll call him what everyone calls him because that's all he's ever been to me, is that he was always the one our parents pointed to. Their success story. He went to Western for business, married someone with a law degree, had 2 kids and a house in Oakville with a 2-car garage. My parents talked about his mortgage payments the way other parents talk about their grandchildren, proudly, in detail, to anyone who would listen. When I bought my condo, my mother asked if I was sure I didn't want to wait for something bigger. When he bought his house, my father drove 2 hours to help him move furniture. I don't say this to be bitter. I say it because it's the context you need. My father and I had a particular kind of relationship where he was always just slightly disappointed in whatever I was doing, even when what I was doing was objectively fine. I changed my major once in university from environmental science to business administration, and he brought it up for 4 years afterward, not aggressively, just as a reference point. You tend to change your mind. That kind of thing. My mother was warmer, but she deferred to him in most things, and after a while I stopped telling them much. Not out of spite. Just because the effort of translating my life into something they could approve of was exhausting, and I had limited bandwidth. My aunt, my father's younger sister, was different. She lived in Guelph, about 45 minutes from Hamilton, and she was the person I called when I needed to actually talk. She'd been through her own version of the family dynamic. She understood it without me having to diagram it. We had dinner together once a month, sometimes more. She was 63, recently retired from teaching high school history, and she had the particular quality of very good teachers, which is that she asked questions and then actually waited for the answer. She was the second call I made from the hospital. My brother was the first. The accident happened on a Wednesday in February. Black ice on the 403, which anyone who has driven in southern Ontario in winter knows is not an unusual situation, but remains terrifying every single time. I was heading home from a site visit, and the car ahead of me braked suddenly, and I braked, and my Civic went sideways across 2 lanes before hitting the barrier on the left shoulder. The airbag deployed. I'm still not sure exactly what happened to my right arm, but the initial assessment at the ER was a fracture of the radius along with some soft tissue damage to my shoulder. 3 ribs on my left side were cracked. I had a mild concussion. None of it was life-threatening. I want to be clear about that. This wasn't a situation where anyone needed to rush to my bedside to say goodbye. But I was alone, I was in pain, and I had just been told I needed surgery on my arm the following morning to properly set the fracture. The surgeon, a calm woman with short grey hair, who spoke in the unhurried way of someone who has explained things to frightened people thousands of times, told me it was a straightforward procedure, that I'd be under general anesthetic for about 90 minutes, and that someone should be available to take me home afterward and stay with me for at least the first 24 hours. "Is there family we can contact?" she asked. "I'll call them," I said. I called my brother first because he was closer. He lives 30 minutes from Hamilton. He has a car. He has a wife at home who could theoretically hold things together for a night. I wasn't asking him to rearrange his life. I was asking him to be available the next morning to drive me home from surgery. He texted back 12 minutes later. Can this wait? We're in the middle of something. Call tomorrow. I stared at that message for a while. I tried to think about what at 2047 in the morning he could be in the middle of that was more pressing than his sister calling from a hospital. I couldn't come up with anything that satisfied me. I put the phone down. Then I called my aunt. She picked up on the second ring. "What's wrong?" she said, because she has always been the kind of person who answers a late-night call assuming something is wrong, and she is usually right. I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm coming." "You don't have to come tonight," I said. "The surgery isn't until morning." "I'm coming," she said again, and hung up. She arrived at the hospital at 4:15 a.m., still in her coat over what were clearly pajamas, carrying a canvas bag with a thermos of tea and a granola bar because she knows I don't eat well when I'm stressed. She sat in the chair beside my bed and didn't say anything dramatic. She just sat there, and I cannot tell you how much that meant to me. That specific quality of presence, someone choosing to be in the room. My parents had not called back. My brother had not called back. The surgery went fine. I woke up groggy and nauseous, which my aunt had predicted, and she was there when I came out of recovery. We took a cab back to my condo because she doesn't drive on highways, and I thought that was completely reasonable and also kind of funny in the way that families are sometimes funny when you let yourself find it that way. She stayed 3 days. She made soup. She helped me shower with my arm wrapped in a garbage bag. She figured out how to work the TV remote, which has too many buttons, and we watched 3 episodes of a documentary series about national parks. It was one of the most peaceful stretches of time I can remember in years. My parents called on day 4. My brother had apparently told them about the accident at some point. I don't know when. And my father called in the late afternoon. He asked how I was doing, and I said I was recovering. He said it sounded like I'd had quite the ordeal. My mother got on the line and said she hoped I wasn't overdoing it. They asked if I had everything I needed. I said yes, my aunt had been here. There was a small silence after I said that, the kind of silence that means something. And then my father said he was glad I'd had someone. They didn't come, not that week, not the next week. My brother called once, about 6 days after the accident, and asked how the arm was doing and mentioned that things had been really hectic at work. I said I understood. I didn't, particularly, but it seemed like the path of least resistance, and I was tired. Here's the thing I didn't know yet. I had set up a financial power of attorney 2 years earlier at the suggestion of a lawyer friend who told me everyone should have their documents in order. I'd named my brother as my substitute decision-maker for finances, because at the time he seemed like the responsible choice. He was good with money, he lived nearby, and I'd trusted him. I'd also set up a healthcare directive that named him as my representative for medical decisions in the event I was incapacitated. I had given him a copy of both documents. I had not thought about them much since then. What I did not know, lying in my condo, recovering from surgery, was that my brother had looked at those documents very carefully. I didn't find out until I tried to check my Simplii account 3 weeks after the accident. I was sitting at my kitchen table, arm in a sling, laptop open, trying to figure out when I'd be able to go back to work and whether my short-term disability coverage through work was going to bridge the gap in a way that made sense. I logged into my account. I looked at the balance. It was $14,000 lower than it should have been. I sat there for a long moment thinking I had miscounted something, or that a large bill had gone through that I'd forgotten, or that I was misremembering what the balance was supposed to be. I went through the transaction history. There had been 2 transfers made while I was in the hospital and in my first week of recovery. The first, on the day after my surgery, was for $8,500. The second, 3 days later, was for $5,600. Both had been authorized by my brother, using the financial power of attorney I had given him. I called my bank. I spent 45 minutes on hold and then spoke to someone who explained, very carefully, that the transactions had been executed with valid documentation and that investigating whether the POA had been misused would require me to formally dispute the transfers and potentially involve legal counsel. She was sympathetic but not optimistic. She gave me a reference number. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I hung up. Then I called my aunt. My aunt came over that evening. She brought dinner, butter chicken from the place on King Street that we both like. and she sat across from me while I showed her the account statements. She looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked at me. "Do you know what he used it for?" she asked. I shook my head. I hadn't called him yet. I wasn't sure I could do it without saying something I couldn't take back. "Do you want me to call him?" she asked. "No," I said. "I need to do it." I called him the next morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice normal, the same voice he always uses with me, a little distracted, slightly impatient at the edges. I told him I'd been looking at my account. There was a pause. Not long. But it was there. He said the transfers had been loans. He said he'd been planning to tell me once I was feeling better. He said he'd had some cash flow issues, something about a renovation that had gone over budget and a payment schedule on his car lease that he hadn't managed well, and he'd known the money was sitting there and that I was in no condition to need it immediately. He said he was going to pay it back. He said he didn't see what the big deal was. It was family money. I asked him if he understood what a power of attorney was. He said of course he did. I asked him if he understood that it was not a permission slip to take money from my account for his personal expenses. He said I was overreacting. He said I was always like this. He said that I had never been grateful for the things the family had done for me, and that I was making him the villain for trying to manage a temporary problem. I didn't say anything for a while. I was looking out my kitchen window at the gray February sky, at the thin line of smoke coming from the neighbor's chimney. I was thinking about the text message. Can this wait? We're in the middle of something. I was thinking about the hospital room at 2047 in the morning. I was thinking about my aunt, arriving in her pajamas with a thermos of tea. "I'm going to need the money back," I said, "and I'm going to make some changes to my documents." He started to say something else, but I'd already said what I needed to say. I ended the call. I want to tell you what I did next, because this is the part that people sometimes get wrong about situations like this. They assume it's about revenge. It wasn't. Or maybe there was a small piece of it that was, I'm 31, not a saint. But mostly it was about something simpler. I had built something for myself. Not a lot, not by some measures, but it was mine. An RSP with 4 years of contributions. A TFSA I'd been disciplined about. A savings account that was supposed to be for emergencies, which is exactly what my brother had decided his renovation overrun was. I made an appointment with a lawyer, a real estate and estate lawyer with a small practice in the West End of Hamilton, someone my aunt had used when she was settling her own affairs a few years back. She was thorough and matter-of-fact and did not seem surprised by anything I told her, which I found oddly comforting. We revoked the financial power of attorney in full. I put in place a new limited one, naming my aunt as my sole substitute decision-maker, with specific restrictions on what she could and couldn't do on my behalf. And honestly, the restrictions were mostly formalities, because I trusted her. But the lawyer said it was good practice to have them explicit anyway. We updated my healthcare directive in the same way. My brother's name was removed from everything. The lawyer also sent a formal letter on my behalf to my brother, outlining the unauthorized transfers and requesting full repayment within 30 days. It was not aggressive. It was simply precise. It referenced the relevant provisions of the Substitute Decisions Act and noted that further steps might be required if the matter wasn't resolved. He called me the day he received it. He was angry in the way people get when they've been caught and aren't ready to admit it. Loud, then quiet, then weirdly conciliatory. He said I was making this into something it didn't need to be. I said I agreed with that and that he could make it simple by returning the money. He transferred $14,100 to my account 11 days later. The extra $100 he didn't explain and I didn't ask. My parents called me after my brother called them, which I had expected. My mother cried a little and said she didn't understand why things had to be like this. My father was more measured. He said he thought I'd handled the situation in a very cold way and that families should be able to work things out without lawyers getting involved. I listened to him say this and thought about all the things I could say back, about the text message, about the 4-day gap before they called, about what it had meant to wake up from surgery and see my aunt's face and not theirs. I didn't say any of those things, not because I was being gracious, but because I understood by then that saying them would not produce the response I actually wanted. The response I actually wanted, some genuine acknowledgement, some moment of recognition, was not something I could extract from a phone call. That was the hardest thing to accept, and also the most freeing. "I hear you," I said. "I'm going to keep living my life the way I think is right." My father said he hoped I'd reconsider my attitude. I said I appreciated the call and that I loved them because I do, in the complicated way you love people who are not quite able to love you back in the form you need. Then I said goodbye. A few practical things changed after that, and I want to mention them because they matter more than the dramatic parts. I sat down with a financial advisor, something I'd been putting off, and properly mapped out what my short and long-term goals looked like. I updated my beneficiary designations on my RRSP and TFSA. I set up a separate account that no one has access to, not even for transfer purposes, which requires me to log in and initiate any outgoing payments myself. I reviewed all my legal documents with actual attention this time, not just filing them away because a friend said I should. I also, and this one surprised me, started actually reading my policy documents for my work's disability coverage. Turns out my short-term disability covered 14 weeks at 70% of my salary, and my employer's benefits had a provision for paramedical services that covered part of my physiotherapy. I hadn't known any of this because I'd never needed to know it. Now I did. My arm healed. It took longer than the surgeon had predicted, which she'd warned me might happen. But by late April, I was back at work on reduced hours, and by June, I was full-time again. My condo is still on Barton Street. I planted some herbs on the balcony in May, which my aunt helped me with because apparently she has opinions about basil placement. She and I still have dinner once a month, usually more. She's the person I text when something funny happens at work, and the person I call when something confusing happens at work, and the person I called when I got a promotion in September and needed to tell someone immediately. I haven't talked to my brother much. Not because of a dramatic falling out. We don't have that kind of relationship. We're just distant now in a way that feels accurate to what we actually are to each other. My parents and I talk every few weeks. It's polite. I don't tell them much. It's not that different from before, if I'm honest, except that I no longer have the low-grade hope that the next call will be the one where something shifts. That hope is expensive and I'm done paying for it. What I have instead is this. I know who shows up. I know who answers the phone at 2047 in the morning. I know who arrives in their pajamas with a thermos of tea and doesn't make you explain why you needed them there. That knowledge, the absolute clarity of it after years of trying to read more generosity into people than they actually possessed, is worth more to me than I have words to say. It doesn't look like much from the outside, maybe, but from the inside it feels like finally being able to breathe normally after months of holding your chest carefully still. I'm not who my family needed me to be. I'm not the version of myself that fits neatly into the story they were telling about our family. I used to grieve that. I still do, sometimes late at night when I'm tired and the grief comes quietly, without warning, like weather. But I'm also exactly who I need to be. And I showed up for myself with the right documents and the right people in my corner, and that turned out to be more than enough. I keep coming back to one image from that night. A hospital room at 2047 in the morning, a phone face down on a blanket, and a text message I didn't know how to answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because I understood, in the way you understand things when your body is hurt and your defenses are down, that no words would change what the message already meant. My brother made a choice that night, and then, a few weeks later, he made another one, quieter, more deliberate, with documents I had trusted him to hold. Those two choices, taken together, told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person he decided to be. Not the kind I'd hoped for, but clearly the kind he was. What I've learned, really learned, the kind that settles in your chest rather than just sitting in your head, is that integrity isn't a quality people announce. It's what they do when they think the circumstances make it easy not to. My brother thought I was in no condition to notice. He thought the paperwork was an opportunity. He was wrong, but only because I'd been paying closer attention to my own life than he'd given me credit for. That's something I had to build over years, the habit of knowing what I had, documenting it, understanding it, Not exciting work. Not the kind of thing that makes for a good story until suddenly it does. My aunt drove to the hospital at 4 in the morning in her pajamas. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask if I was sure I needed her. She just came. That's the thing about people who are genuinely good. They don't perform it. They just show up quietly, consistently, with tea in a thermos and enough sense to know that sometimes presence is the whole point. I think about what it took to get from that hospital room to the afternoon I sat across from a lawyer and calmly revoked every document that had my brother's name on it. It took information, knowing what a power of attorney actually meant, what my rights were, what the Substitute Decisions Act said. It took the willingness to look at a number on a screen and not explain it away out of loyalty or wishful thinking. And it took the steadiness to pick up the phone and say the hard thing without cruelty and without backing down. None of that came from one moment of bravery. It came from a lot of small decisions made over a lot of ordinary days to take my own life seriously, to save, to document, to ask questions, to trust the right people and be honest with myself about which people those actually were. You learn who loves you when you're inconvenient. That's the version of the lesson I didn't want but couldn't argue with. And once you know it, really know it, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived fact, it changes how you spend your energy. I don't spend mine waiting for people to become who I need them to be anymore. I spend it on the ones who already showed me. That, I think, is what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not anger, not a strategy for revenge, just the quiet, hard-won knowledge that you are allowed to protect what you've built, to surround yourself with people who show up in the dark, and to make decisions that reflect what you actually value, even when those decisions are uncomfortable, even when they cost you something, even when the people on the other side of them think you're being cold. You're not being cold, you're just finally being clear.